Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful journeys of resilience, hope, and transformation. In today's story, we'll follow Emily's path through love, manipulation, and ultimately, freedom. Her relationship with Daniel seemed perfect at first, but it quickly turned into a nightmare of control and abuse. Emily's courage to stand up and reclaim her life is nothing short of inspiring. Stay with us as we explore her emotional journey, the lessons learned, and the strength it took to rebuild. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us as we begin today's story. It was one of those crisp, clear evenings in New York City, where the skyline seems to stretch endlessly into the night, and everything around you feels alive with possibility. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 26, and life seemed so full of promise. I had a steady job as a communication specialist at a well-regarded firm, and I felt that everything was falling into place. I was independent, confident, and felt the excitement of being young and carving my path in the world. It was at a corporate networking event, one of those typical events you attend to meet people and exchange business cards. When I first met Daniel, at first, it seemed like just another evening, mingling with colleagues and associates. But when Daniel walked into the room, everything seemed to shift. He was tall, confident, and carried an air of authority that commanded attention. You know the type, the kind of person whose presence is almost magnetic. He had a smile that could light up a room, and his eyes, deep brown and so intense, seemed to see right through you. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I felt drawn to him from the very first moment we locked eyes. We started talking, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. He complimented me on my work, my ambitions, my drive, and before I knew it, I was laughing at his witty anecdotes. He was charming, almost too charming, and I couldn't help but feel flattered by his attention. By the end of the evening, he had asked for my number, and I found myself giving it to him without a second thought. I was intrigued, curious about this man who seemed too perfect to be real. Our first date was nothing short of magical. Daniel went above and beyond to make it special. He took me to one of the best restaurants in the city, a cozy little spot with a candlelit table that overlooked the skyline. The evening was seamless. Everything from the food to the atmosphere was perfect. Daniel was an excellent listener, something I appreciated more than anything. He seemed genuinely interested in my life, my career, and my dreams. As I shared stories about my family and aspirations, he listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering his own thoughts. There was this warmth in the way he made me feel heard. As though he valued everything I said, I was swept off my feet. He spoke about his own dreams too, his desire to build a business empire and how he believed hard work would get him there. His ambition mirrored my own, and I felt this connection, this unspoken understanding between us. By the end of the night, as he walked me to my car, he took my hand gently and planted a soft kiss on it. I felt my heart flutter, a connection I hadn't experienced in years. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's courtship of me continued with an intensity that I could hardly keep up with. He surprised me with flowers at work, thoughtful gifts that showed he paid attention to the little details about my life. He would show up at my apartment unexpectedly with a smile and a kiss, making me feel like I was the most important person in his world. We spent hours together, talking about the future, about building a life together. I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had found my soulmate. My friends couldn't stop teasing me about how lucky I was to have found someone like Daniel. They said I deserved it. I agreed. It felt too perfect to be true. And in a way, it was. I didn't see it then, but there were shadows creeping around the edges of his perfect exterior, shadows I was blind to because I was so enchanted by his devotion and attention. It wasn't long before I decided it was time for Daniel to meet my parents. My father, Charles, was a bit more reserved than my mother, Susan, but I thought he'd warm to him over time. Charles was a man of few words, but his military background made him an excellent judge of character. Susan was more outgoing, but she too had a keen sense for reading people. Daniel was eager to meet them. Of course, He arrived at our family dinner impeccably dressed, carrying a bouquet for Susan, and greeting Charles with polite firmness. Over dinner, Daniel was charming, telling my mother about his business ventures and sharing his vision for the future. My father, though, didn't seem as impressed. I could tell something was off in the way Charles looked at Daniel. He was polite, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as if assessing him with a level of caution I hadn't expected. But I dismissed it. I was convinced that Daniel would win him over in time. The evening went by without much incident, and Daniel became a regular fixture in my life. He spent time with me, with my friends, and even with my family. He had a way of integrating himself so smoothly into my life that it almost felt as though he'd always been there. And I loved it. It felt like the start of something beautiful. Something lasting. Little did I know, Daniel's charm was only a carefully crafted facade, hiding a much darker side that would eventually unravel everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and my own worth. I couldn't see it then, of course. But looking back now, I realize that the signs were there, hidden beneath the surface. The way he always made me feel like I was the center of his world. The way he showered me with attention and affection, it all felt too perfect. Too orchestrated. The man I thought I knew was just a mask. And I would soon find myself tangled in a web of manipulation and control. But for now, I was happy. In my heart, I truly believed I had found my happily ever after. As the weeks turned into months, something in Daniel began to shift. At first, it was subtle, little comments here and there, things I could easily dismiss or explain away. I remember one evening, I was out with a few friends from work, having a laugh at a local cafe. When I got home that night, Daniel was already waiting for me. His face was dark, his mood icy. He didn't say a word when I walked through the door, but I could feel the tension in the air. I thought maybe he was just having a bad day at work. But when he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than I expected. "You didn't tell me you were going out tonight," he said, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place, anger, perhaps, or hurt. "Why do you need them when you have me?" I was taken aback. I hadn't done anything wrong. Had I? I had simply gone out with my colleagues to unwind after a long week. But Daniel's tone, half joking, yet dripping with seriousness, made me second-guess myself. I apologized, telling him I should have kept him in the loop. He forgave me quickly, but the unease lingered. I had brushed it off, telling myself it was just a miscommunication, a bump in the road of an otherwise perfect relationship. However, the subtle comments kept coming. They became more frequent, more pointed. Daniel began questioning my every move, my every interaction with my friends, my colleagues, even my family. His jealousy slowly morphed into possessiveness. He would call me multiple times a day, asking where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. At first, I didn't think much of it. I convinced myself that he just cared deeply about me, that it was a sign of love. But deep down, a small voice told me something wasn't right. One evening, when I'd been out for dinner with a few friends, I came home to find him waiting at the door, his expression clouded with anger. This time, it wasn't just a comment, it was an accusation. "You think you can just leave me and go have fun with them without even telling me?" I thought I was more important than that. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. It was the first real argument we had. I hadn't thought that my choice to spend time with my friends would upset him so much. But his anger, it was disproportionate, unreasonable. I apologized, of course, because that's what I always did. I didn't want to make him angrier, didn't want to deal with the tension. After a while, he forgave me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the argument, it was the fact that he was so controlling. It was the way his jealousy was starting to suffocate me. As the weeks passed, his behavior intensified. I started to feel like I was walking on eggshells. It wasn't just about where I was anymore, it was about who I was with. When I was with them, how long I was gone. Everything became a point of contention. I found myself constantly reassuring him, explaining myself, apologizing even when I had done nothing wrong. And I hated it. I hated how small it made me feel. How powerless. I hated that my once vibrant, independent life was shrinking in the face of his demands. I used to be the type of person who made my own decisions, who knew my worth. But now, every little thing felt like an attack. And every time I stood up for myself, I felt the weight of his disapproval. It wasn't long before I noticed a change in me. The person I was, the strong, independent woman I had always prided myself on being, was fading away. In her place was a quiet, cautious version of myself, someone who was terrified of causing a fight, terrified of triggering his anger. It wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. His controlling behavior seeped into every aspect of my life, slowly stripping me of my confidence, my freedom, and my sense of self. I didn't even recognize the person I had become. And yet, despite everything, I convinced myself that it was just a phase, that things would get better. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just stress from work or the pressure of our relationship moving so quickly. I clung to the hope that things would return to the way they were when I had first fallen for him, the attentive, caring, loving man I thought I had found. But deep down, I knew that the man I had fallen in love with was slipping further away. And I had no idea how to stop it. As I moved further into the relationship, Daniel's facade of perfection began to crumble. I was becoming someone I barely recognized. Someone afraid to speak up. Afraid to fight for what I needed. All for the sake of keeping him happy. Keeping him satisfied. Keeping the peace. But I was losing myself in the process. What was left of the woman I had once been was slipping through my fingers like sand. And I didn't know how to stop it. It was only after I found out I was pregnant that I allowed myself to truly believe things would get better. At first, I thought the news would bring us closer. That this baby would be the turning point in our relationship. The anchor that would steady us both. Daniel, when I shared the news, seemed genuinely excited at first. He promised me that we would be a family. That everything would be perfect. I allowed myself to feel reassured. To think that perhaps my fears were unfounded. And that we could make this work. But in the weeks that followed, his behavior began to shift again. The initial excitement of the pregnancy faded, replaced by mood swings and growing irritability. I noticed how he would snap at me over the smallest things, blaming me for his stress. It was as though the weight of impending fatherhood had crushed his composure, leaving a man I barely recognized in his place. One evening, as I was making dinner, I accidentally dropped a pot. It wasn't a big deal, nothing was broken, but when Daniel entered the kitchen, he exploded. He shouted at me, accusing me of being careless, of not respecting him, of not doing things right. His words were sharp, cutting into me. For the first time, I felt genuinely afraid of his anger. The loudness of his voice echoed in my mind as I tried to stay calm, to explain that it was a simple mistake. But the apology I offered didn't seem to matter. His rage only grew. I didn't know what to do. I had been so used to making excuses for his behavior, to convincing myself it was just stress, just the pressure of becoming a father. But now, even I couldn't ignore the signs. His aggression had escalated, and it wasn't just the words anymore. There were moments when I would walk into a room and feel his icy stare. His silence so thick that it made the air feel suffocating. When I tried to talk to him about his outbursts, he would dismiss me, claiming it was just the stress of life. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And yet, I clung to the hope that it would get better. The thought of bringing a child into this relationship, into this environment, made me feel torn. I didn't want to believe that I had made a mistake, that the man I had fallen in love with had changed so drastically. I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I did more, if I were more understanding, everything would fall back into place. But the truth was hard to ignore. The emotional abuse, the control, the gaslighting, it was all wearing me down. I felt isolated, like I was losing my grip on reality. I couldn't talk to my friends about it. How could I? How could I admit that the man I had once thought was perfect had turned into someone I feared? How could I admit that the life I had once dreamed of was slipping through my fingers? Then, one night, it happened. The thing I had always feared. Daniel had been particularly moody that evening, snapping at me over things that didn't make sense. I had just asked him to take out the trash. Something small and insignificant, but it set him off. His face darkened, and before I could react, he lashed out. His fist slammed onto the table, making me flinch. I didn't recognize the man in front of me. This wasn't the person I had fallen in love with. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. And for the first time, I felt genuine fear. Daniel quickly apologized, claiming it was stress, that I had provoked him, that it would never happen again. But the words felt hollow. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to face the truth. The person I had once trusted, the man I had thought was my soulmate, had become someone I feared. And I knew deep down that this wasn't just a phase. This was who he really was. And I didn't know how to get out. I wanted to talk to my parents, to tell them what was happening. But fear stopped me. What would they think? What would they say? I couldn't bear the thought of their disappointment, of them knowing how much I had allowed myself to be controlled and manipulated. So, I stayed, hoping that things would change. That maybe, just maybe, things would go back to how they were when we first met. But inside, I knew the truth. I was living in a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up. It wasn't until the incident that left me physically bruised that I realized I could no longer pretend everything was fine. That night, Daniel's anger had reached a terrifying point. It was as though a switch had been flipped. The kind, attentive man I thought I had known no longer existed. The blows, both physical and emotional, had crushed whatever hope I had left that this was just a phase. After the violent outburst, I stayed silent, frozen with disbelief. I couldn't believe the man I had once trusted, the one who had held me in his arms and whispered promises of a beautiful future, was capable of this. My body trembled as I sat in my room that night, staring at the bruise on my cheek, trying to convince myself that it was a one-time incident. But I knew deep down it wasn't. This was no accident. This was something darker, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I didn't know how to reach out, how to tell anyone about what had been happening. But in the quiet of that room, with my heart heavy and my body sore, I realized that I couldn't hide from the truth any longer. I had to talk to someone. And the first person I turned to was my father, Charles. I knew he would never judge me, never make me feel like I was weak for what had happened. I needed someone to believe me, to help me escape the life I had found myself trapped in. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called him. My voice wavered as I spoke, and I could hear the concern in his voice as he listened. After I explained, he didn't hesitate for a second. He was furious, and rightfully so. He knew something was off with Daniel from the beginning. But hearing the truth, hearing the fear in my voice, was enough to convince him that action had to be taken. Charles immediately began investigating. With his background in the military, he had a network of people he could trust. And soon he uncovered enough to confirm his worst suspicions. Daniel's life was full of lies, failed business ventures, unpaid debts, shady associates. But it wasn't just his finances that were disturbing. It was the people he had manipulated before, the women he had mistreated. Daniel had a pattern, and I was just the latest in a long string of victims. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. Finally, someone else knew. Finally, someone was fighting for me. But even with the support of my family, I still felt broken, like a part of me had been lost forever. I was carrying so much guilt, so much shame, for staying as long as I did. I had failed myself, failed to recognize the warning signs, failed to protect the person I used to be. But I had to push those thoughts aside. I couldn't let them define me. In the following days, things moved quickly. My father worked tirelessly to build a case. He gathered evidence from Daniel's past, speaking to people who had once trusted him, learning of the lies and deceit. He didn't want me to go through this alone anymore, and he was determined to make sure Daniel faced the consequences of his actions. The more my father uncovered, the clearer it became that Daniel had been living a double life, one of deception and manipulation. And then came the day I decided to take the stand. I can't explain what it was like. Standing there in that courtroom, I had spent months convincing myself that I couldn't do this, that I wasn't strong enough to face Daniel, to expose him for who he truly was. But as I walked to the stand and looked around the room, I felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about seeking justice for myself. It was about standing up for every woman who had been silenced by fear. For every person who had been manipulated into believing they were undeserving of better. I spoke, my voice steady but my heart racing. I told them everything. How Daniel had wooed me with his charm. How he had manipulated me into thinking I was lucky to be with him. And how, over time, he became someone I feared. I spoke of the emotional abuse, the controlling behavior, the gaslighting. I spoke of the physical violence, of the terror I felt in my own home. As I testified, I glanced at Daniel. His face was void of any remorse. And yet, I could see the fear behind his eyes. He had spent years building a facade. But now, the cracks were showing. The room was silent, hanging on my every word. And I knew this was the moment my life would change forever. When the verdict came, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Guilty. The words echoed in my mind as I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. Justice had been served. But it wasn't just about punishing Daniel, it was about reclaiming my life. It was about finding myself again. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that I could rebuild. That I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. The journey was far from over. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. As I moved forward, I realized that healing wasn't a straight path. There were days when the weight of everything I had been through felt unbearable. But with every step, I grew stronger. My family, especially my father Charles and my mother Susan, were there for me every step of the way. Their unwavering support gave me the strength I needed to reclaim my life. My daughter, Esther, became my light, a reminder that there was always hope. No matter how dark the past had been. Rebuilding my life was a journey. And there were times I doubted myself. But I kept pushing forward. I rediscovered my love for painting, found solace in therapy, and reconnected with old friends who had supported me all along. The woman I had once been, vibrant and full of life, was slowly returning, stronger and wiser. The public exposure of Daniel's actions didn't erase the pain, but it brought me a sense of justice. He was held accountable for what he did, and the life I had been trapped in no longer had power over me. Now, as I sit here with my daughter in my arms, I realize that my past doesn't define me. I am not a victim, I am a survivor. And my future is filled with possibilities. If you've been through something similar or just need a reminder that you are not alone, I hope my story has given you some strength. Remember, no matter how dark things may seem, there is always hope on the other side. Thank you for listening to my journey. Please subscribe to the channel to follow more life stories and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Stay strong, and take care.